How's it going, folks? So in this lecture, I wanted to conclude our discussion of Mexico after the independence period. So as we know, at this time, Mexico has now declared its independence from Spain. And as we know at this point, the independence movement at this point, I guess could be characterized as a conservative victory, right, for the conservatives in Mexico. New Spain at this point has now transitioned into being a monarchy, the Mexican Empire. And of course, this short period is known as the First Mexican Empire. Technically, it's an empire because, technically it's an empire because it's a monarchy, except that the First Mexican Empire didn't expand like an empire typically does. But nevertheless, right, this is considered as the period as the First Mexican Empire, because of course, much later we would have the period of the Second Mexican Empire, when Mexico was occupied by the French and under General Maximilian. But anyways, in terms of how we can characterize this time period, right, definitely, this was definitely a time of disarray, right? The economy was in shambles. There was a lack of political professionalism in the new Mexican Empire, as well as among the ruling elite. And one of the large lasting criticisms of Iturbide at this point, right, was that he of Emperor Iturbide at this point, right, is that he seemed to be more concerned, right, with being recognized and respected as a legitimate French king, right, or a French-like king ruling over Mexico, and seemed to be less concerned, right, of administering the cult of a new kingdom. And so we learned that he then goes on to establish, right, a French-style royal guard, which he called the Knights of Guadalupe. But let's talk about what are some of the factors, right, that lead to the rise of Iturbide in the first place. So for starters, we learned that he appoints a provisional junta, a 5-man regency, to govern the First Mexican Empire. And this junta gives him the title of this as the Supreme General of Land and Sea. Specifically, he gets this title, the Generalissimo de Tierra y Mar. No, not the General, the Generalissimo. And we learned that at this point, most of Iturbide's allies controlled this new Congress, as well as the committees itself. And of course, by no means were they friendly to people, or to anyone for that matter, who had any oppositional views. They were very quick to quell discontent at this time, and which was important for them to do so because this was a time where monarchy was still very much a very unpopular idea. This was also a time when Enlightenment ideologies that did not favor monarchy, right, were also being absorbed and circulated in New Spain. So there was definitely countercurrents, right, against retaining monarchical government in Mexico. But however, right, in order to sort of quell any sort of discontent or to create this sort of illusion, right, that the majority of the Mexican people supported him, we learned that Iturbide would go on to stage a pro-Iturbide rally. And in this case, right, he would order a group of his supporters to stage a protest outside of his house. And the role was for them to threaten to start a riot if he did not declare himself as the Emperor of Mexico. So, so according to Iturbide, he goes on to say that he didn't want to start a riot. So he went onto his balcony and would agree to the demands for him to be the new Mexican emperor. So subsequently, right, these events would help propel Iturbide as the first emperor of Mexico. And this title was supposed to be hereditary and passed down to his children. But unfortunately for him, the Mexicans unfortunately for him, but fortunately for the Mexicans who were opposed to monarchical rule, neither Iturbide nor the First Mexican Empire would last long enough to name a second emperor. So this new monarchy, perhaps ironically, was modeled after the French monarchy. And I say that it's ironic considering that the French monarchs were ultimately the ones who provoked the Mexican independence movement, right? Beginning with the Bourbon reforms. But this is not ironic, right? Considering that Iturbide and conservative Mexican revolutionaries were royalists to begin with, who were in favor of monarchy. And they only turned their back on Spain after the king recognized the 1812 liberal constitution that would have created, right, a constitutional monarchy or encouraged Mexico to recognize a constitutional monarchy had it remained as New Spain. But nevertheless, digress. But I do want to say, I want to mention in fairness, right, that the authors also of the text also mention on page 236 quotes, they mentioned that while the outer trappings of the empire were pretentious to an absurd degree, they were not entirely without purpose and meaning. Iturbide realized that the entire governmental system of the colonial period had been predicated upon loyalty to the king and the crown. The emperor wanted to capitalize upon the time-tested tradition. Okay. So what were problems facing the new Mexican empire? And for that matter, right, the greatest challenges faced by the newly crowned emperor Iturbide. So for starters, right, at this point, the empire was relatively huge, right? That Mexico at this time stretched north into California and encompassed most of the present-day U.S. Southwest. And south, right, it included most of modern Central America with the exception of Panama. And second, right, it had troubles in gaining recognition from its powerful neighbor to the north, the United States, at this time, Iturbide sought recognition from the US in order to establish commercial ties, as well as to not just necessarily to establish commercial ties, but also, you know, to ensure that its northern Mexican provinces would be, I guess, free from harassment or colonization from the United States. Of course, spoiler alert, we know that by 1846, Mexico's northern provinces, right, would no longer be, right, in its possession. And even before that, right, came under threat during the Texas Revolution. But I digress because we're not there yet in this chapter. The third, right, Iturbide also inherited a destitute Mexican economy, right, that for many years had been plagued by these backward mercantilist policies from the colonial period. And again, this led to the unstable economy, contributed to economic depressions, and also social discontent with the new regime. And fourth, also Iturbide continued to face public criticism of his monarchical government. And among some of the most prominent critics at this time were Fray Servando Teresa de Mier, as well as Carlos Maria de Bustamante. And Iturbide, of course, would have both of these men arrested. And notably, I should point out that these were men who were in favor of a more centralist Republican government rather than a monarchy. Granted, right, they were more for they were part of more of the conservative centrist camp rather than the liberal camp, right? Which of course would create problems later on, which I'll go into in just a bit. But this criticism towards Iturbide was so unrelenting, right, that even in his own government, that Iturbide would eventually decide to dissolve the legislative branch of the government. Yet, as we'll also learn in subsequent generations after, and subsequent leaders following Iturbide, that Iturbide would not be the last one to exercise these sorts of extreme measures in order to silence his critics. And his practice of using emergency presidential powers in these times of crisis, this would be a trend that would be followed by future Mexican leaders. And among Iturbide's most powerful allies at this time was General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And of course, he would be a key player that will be that we will be seeing later on, taking the center stage, right, in order to get rid of unpopular leaders. However, right, Iturbide would make the mistake of burning his bridges with Santa Anna, who was probably the only military leader who was probably capable of keeping Iturbide's regime in power. Previously, Santa Anna was put in charge of driving out a group of Spaniards who tried to recolonize or reconquer Mexico at San Juan de Ulloa. And tensions with Iturbide and Santa Anna began when the emperor claimed that Santa Anna was not doing enough to ensure a quick and brutal defeat of the Spanish, right, of the Spanish enemies at this time. And so, of course, the relationship soured ever since. And eventually, along with other anti-Iturbide supporters, Santa Anna would agree that he also had enough of Iturbide. And in December the 1st of 1822, Santa Anna would lead 400 troops to Veracruz in order to proclaim a republic. And he would, of course, articulate the terms of this revolt in his Plan de Veracruz. He went on to form alliances with the Mexican independence movements, with the all-stars of the Mexican independence movement, such as Vicente Guerrero, Nicolás Bravo, and Guadalupe de Victoria, which of course made the revolt in this sense even that more popular and that much more prestigious. And of course, eventually this group would reach Mexico City, and they would force Iturbide to capitulate in February of 1823. And in total, Iturbide only lasted 10 months in office. So what can we say about the first Mexican empire besides the fact that it was, politically speaking, an utter failure? Well, for starters, we learned that this new Criollo oligarchy just replaced an old Gachupin oligarchy on the one hand. In many ways, right, it maintained the white supremacy, right, of the traditional colonial elite. Okay, in the sense, right, keeping both but in this sense, right, shifting from Gachupin supremacy to Criollo supremacy. In a sense, right, you could say that the status quo was retained, except with a new face. And ultimately, right, it was not able to solve any economic problems that went back to the times of New Spain, right? Granted, the New Mexican Empire did not survive long enough to make any meaningful impacts on the economy, but not that the government at the time, not that Iturbide ever seemed interested in the plight of the peasants, of the poor. Nevertheless, we can say that despite its flaws, that the first Mexican Empire was at least successful in serving as the sort of the stepping stone that would encourage conservative elites to at least embrace the idea of Mexican independence. Because for many years, right, going back to the Mexican independence movement, since the time of Hidalgo's uprisings, and as well as those by Jose Maria Morelos, the conservative elite in Mexico were the biggest thorn, right, on the biggest impediment, right, to the independence movement, and mostly, right, because they were the most resourced, right, in terms of access, right, to military, to armaments, right. They were the most equipped to fight off the revolutionaries. It was only when the conservatives were on board with the independence movement that it was able to take, that the independence was able to come to fruition in Mexico. And so after Iturbide was ousted, the central concern in New Spain now became to establish a constitutional republican government. And in order to establish this, right, there was, they initiated a junta, a three-man junta was initiated, and each of these men were in charge of governing Mexico provisionally. And notably, these three men were all former military men. They included Nicolás Bravo, Guadalupe Victoria, and Pedro Celestino Negrete. And in November the 27th of 1823, these men met to discuss if the Mexican Republic should be more of a federalist government or if it should be more of a centralist government. And this, of course, would set the stage for further conflict. The Federalists would argue for, under a federalist system, would argue for more autonomy for the states, whereas the centralists would argue for more authority of the central government, right? So essentially less autonomy for the states. But who exactly were the centralists and federalists? What were these camps composed of, and what, I guess, what characterized the centralists and the federalists, right? So we could kind of understand what led to some of their political differences and rivalries. So on the one hand, the centralists, right? The centralists were generally folks who were conservatives. These were folks who were interested in retaining the power of the church and the military. These were folks who were often supported by members of the clergy, the hacendados, and also army officers. And among the most outspoken centralists were Fray Fernando Teresa de Mier and Carlos Maria de Bustamante. And again, these were the same critics of Iturbide previously, right? So although they were the critics of Iturbide, they were still part of the more conservative camp, right? That were more in favor of creating a centralist government. What about the Federalists? Who were they? The Federalists tended to be those who were, politically speaking, these were the liberals, and these were those who generally wanted to limit, interested in limiting the power of the Catholic Church in Mexico. They also wanted to, for Mexico to be a secular state that also recognized equality before the law. What do we mean by that, by recognizing equality before the law? So one of the greatest, in terms of advocating for equality before the law, they advocated for there not to be separate courts for clergymen, for military officials, or for civilians. And the Federalists were generally supported by some of the leading Federalists at the time were men such as Miguel Ramos de Arizpe from Coahuila. The text also mentions, right, Valentin Gomez Farias from Zacatecas. So what was the outcome of this 1824 meeting? Oops, skipped one here. So the outcome of the 1823 meeting, was the creation of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. This would, of course, establish the United Mexican States, or Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos. At the time, the newly formed Mexican state was comprised of 19 states and 4 territories. This made Mexico a federal republic that was complete with an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. It also had, similar to the US, right, a bicameral legislature. It had a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies, and in this case, in the US sense, this would be what we refer to as our House of Representatives. They also had a president. The new constitution also created, of course, the position of the president and the vice president, who was selected by state legislators and not via popular vote. And these folks were to serve, of course, a 4-year term, again, similar to the US. And perhaps that was perhaps nerving to the Mexican liberals, and was the fact that the Catholic Church was allowed to retain its 300-year monopoly on Mexican spiritual life. The president of Mexico was also given extraordinary powers in time of emergency, which allowed for moments of dictatorship in these sorts of vaguely defined times of crisis. And as we will learn in subsequent years, that this privilege would be abused by many subsequent Mexican presidents and dictators until at least the end of the Mexican Revolution, although I'm sure that some would argue that these powers have also been abused in recent times, but again, that's a subject for a different class meeting. So moving forward, the Victoria Presidency. The first elected president of Mexico was none other than Guadalupe Victoria, who was a liberal and a federalist. As his vice president, Nicolas Bravo, and notably the his vice presidential mate was not a federalist nor a liberal. He was a centralist and conservative, and perhaps, right, maybe this decision to have him as his vice president might have to have Nicolas Bravo as the VP might have been to sort of to establish peace, right, or to I guess to foster peace, right, between the Federalist and conservative and the conservative centralist camp, but nevertheless, right, although there was this attempt to kind of mend the differences between the two camps, Bravo would eventually try to overthrow Victoria much later. But nevertheless, right, we also see that we also observe that the centrist and federalist divide would also become manifested in the Freemasonic lodges of Mexico. And this is notable because among Mexico's political elites, many of them were affiliated with Freemasonic fraternities, and these were they essentially used these male gathering spaces, these elite male gathering spaces, to espouse their political views and allegiances. And so notably here, I'm not talking about silly online conspiracy theories, you know, about new world orders or one world governments or about FEMA debt camps. And here, right, at least in the context of Mexico, it's been established in the historiography. It's been clearly observed that Mexico's Freemasonic lodges reflected this federalist centrist divide. On the one hand, you had the York Rite Masons or the Yorkinos, who were associated with the Federalist cause. You also had the Scottish Rite Masons or the Escoceses, who were associated with the Centralist. But what both of these lodges had in common, at least, was that they each distrusted the power of the masses. But what other factors would go on to make President Victoria so unpopular? So on the one hand, right, he was unpopular at least with those who were part of the centrist camp. But what also perhaps more controversially was that Victoria would decide to execute the former Mexican emperor Iturbide, despite the fact that he had this reputation of being a monarchist. He was still respected by some, right, as one of the founding fathers of the Mexican Revolution, despite his controversial past. And what also didn't help Victoria's situation was the lingering and worsening financial situation in Mexico, which also did not help to bolster his popularity. And by 1827, nevertheless, the centralists would again rise up and revolt against Victoria in 1827. This revolt again was led by his VP, his vice presidential running mates at the time, his vice president, Nicolas Bravo. But nevertheless, right, this uprising was unsuccessful. It was actually crushed by General Santa Anna, as well as by Vicente Guerrero. And although this uprising against Victoria was a failure, it nevertheless would set this precedent for future military coups that would emerge in times of political discontent in the new Mexican nation. The second democratically elected Mexican president would be Vicente Guerrero, who was not only a federalist but also a former revolutionary, right? So he infamously, of course, formed that allegiance with Iturbide previously, right? Decided to lay down his arms for the independence movement in alliance with Iturbide. And as his presidential VP running mate was Anastasio Bustamante. Bustamante, of course, would also try to overthrow him later, except unlike Nicolas Bravo, his coup was actually successful. Vicente Guerrero is just some takeaways, right, that should mention here, is that he's famously known for two policies. Notably in 1829, he signed, he ordered for the abolition of African slavery in Mexico. And of course, this was opposed in the territory of Texas, right? Which of course led to discontent among those who were Anglo settlers at the time. But that's also another topic for our following class meeting. He would also call for the expulsion of all Spaniards from Mexico. And this was, again, another controversial policy that would ultimately lead to, again, another uprising against the president, and also would fuel an attempt to, again, by Spain, another attempt by Spain to recolonize Mexico. And so during Guerrero's term, we see that, again, we also see the repeating patterns of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna and his military interventions during Mexico's early national period. In 1829, there is again an attempt to reconquer Mexico for Spain. This time it was led by General Isidro Barradas, who came with 3,000 troops who were deployed from Havana, Cuba, in July of 1829. This person, the person who was, of course, responsible for crushing him, was none other than General Lopez de Santa Anna. And Barradas' troops landed in the coast of Tamaulipas in the summer of 1829. They would go on to occupy the military fort at Tampico, which at the time was abandoned. And by August 21st of 1829, Santa Anna would succeed in assaulting these Barradas troops at Tampico, and eventually getting him to surrender. Nevertheless, right, despite these successes, eventually Bustamante would lead a coup against Guerrero because Guerrero did not relinquish his emergency presidential powers. And Bustamante again succeeds in this case, in this instance, I mean, thanks to the support he received from the military. However, once Bustamante was in power, he was also a very unpopular president. So in order for him to try to forcefully maintain order, Bustamante called for the suppression of the freedom of the press, unless it glorified the government. And this was a sorry move, and another sorry move, right? He would also capture and execute the former president, Vicente Guerrero, who, like Iturbide, was recognized as a hero of the revolution. And sadly, as the text mentions also on page 249, that of the 5 outstanding leaders of the wars of independence, 4, Miguel Hidalgo, Jose Maria Morelos, Agustin de Iturbide, and now Vicente Guerrero, had died before the firing squad. Again, outrage ensued against the many abuses of Bustamante's regime. And once again, Santa Anna would be called to step in to remove yet another unpopular leader from power. Yet, unlike others before him, Santa Anna at this time was not interested in being a politician. He seemed more interested in removing leaders that he saw as problematic and as tyrannical. And after doing so, he just returned back to his estate, right? He didn't, again, try to become the new dictator or replace whoever was in power. But of course, increasingly, the situation would change in the subsequent years, and eventually Santa Anna would become, in many ways, just the same as the caudillos that he sought to overthrow in the years before. So thank you, and look, I will see you all in the next lecture. Thank you.